storytellers, we are going to ask that we all keep our microphones and cameras off so that we can keep the focus on them. We'll be getting started in just a moment here.
If we start at 7 o'clock, it may be the only time we've been on time. Certainly my only time.
Okay, and we're live and recording. I think we're ready to go when you are, Emily. I'll just double check in with our folks at Big Cabbage Radio here.
Do you want me to start, or Pat, do you want to introduce? Okay.
If we're ready to start, I will. Hello, everyone. My name is Pat Chesbrough, and I am the chair of the wonderful Palmer Museum of History and Art. Thank you for coming tonight. This is a kind of an experiment for us as we navigate new waters in the world. And our Untold Stories tonight is more like sitting around the kitchen table and talking about stories from Palmer. We're really working hard as a board to ensure that we are reaching out to local people this year, because we know a lot of people aren't going to be traveling out of state, and a lot of out-of-staters are going to be coming in state. So we really want to make sure we have lots of programs for people who live here who may not have done some of the things that we have to offer at the museum. So we're excited about doing that. We have a great board. They're very active, and we have many things going on. So that's really good. I would urge you, please, obviously this was not a paid event. You don't have to pay to get in the door here, but we really would appreciate you becoming members of the museum. Remember, history is alive, and we have evidence of that tonight with the people that are going to tell us about it. We have a lot of artifacts, but also remember that all of those artifacts were used by real people, and sometimes we know those people, and so that's the cool thing about living in this area. So once more, please join the museum. We've posted in the chat. If you haven't opened up your chat, you might want to. And we posted how to donate there, and we welcome you. And I would like to introduce our moderator tonight, Emily Forstner.
Well, thank you, Pat, and welcome to Untold Stories. Untold Stories has been supportive of the Palmer Museum since 2015. And a shout out to Big Cabbage Radio, who is streaming us as we speak live. And I believe the event will be recorded, and you can get it on the radio website at www.radiofreepalmer.org. And I am Emily Forstner, your host tonight. And I am actually at the museum in the basement. So it's kind of freaky when you look around and see all the artifacts that they're waiting to put up on display. It's in Palmer, in the Matt Valley, the last frontier, you know, where the winters are dark, the falls are bright, and the summers above average. We are the home of the big potato, big cabbage, and let's face it, some really big mountains. Can you imagine if the mountains and veggies could talk, the stories they might tell? Well, no worries, because tonight we have 4 pioneers, and they have stories about them. Tonight's theme is Palmer through the years, and it's taking a look through the lens of history that defines it as a simpler time, perhaps with a slower pace. And we're using a technical app called Zoom to do that. And the irony of that is not lost on me. We are going to, in this high-tech world, try to recreate a kitchen table without the kitchen table. But where you sit around and you talk with your aunt, your uncle, your friends, your neighbors, your grandparents. And though we don't have a kitchen table, perhaps you guys Zooming out there, you might have a piece of pie with us. This is undoubtedly an unusual format, but it is unusual times. And maybe when I think about it, that is the perfect thing to do during the 85th anniversary of the Matanuska Project, when in 1935, over 200 families came to Palmer, maybe with a mix of hope and desperation, to settle. And they came here and they found a very small community already here. Like Leaf Copperroot told me, there was no safety net then. You made it because you worked hard, you were determined, you were resilient, and you helped when you needed to help. Much like I find Palmer today. We have with us 4 pioneers. We have Alan Lynn, the Oberg sisters, Carol Kenley and Lila Willardson, and Leaf Copperroot. Alan Lynn, if you have driven the Glen Highway, the Matanuska Bridge, the Parks Highway, I believe, he was a civil engineer. He wanted to be outside, and if you have driven any of those roads, Alan Lynn was part of it. And the Copperroot family, well, if Alan Lynn helped supervise building it, the Copperroots moved it, built it, dug it, and helped nurse the people in town. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention the veggies, but this used to be dairy country. And the Matanuska Maid, well, they had the World Fair one time, declared it the best ice cream in the world, and cottage cheese. So we would be wrong if we didn't have the daughters of dairy farmer Clyde Oberg, and that's Carol and Lila. So, when you think about it, everyone had to be from somewhere before they arrived elsewhere. And I came here in 1983. I was in search of love, romance, and adventure. And by golly, I found it all. Plus, I got a job. So Zoomers, in the chat, why don't you, in about 5 words or less, let us know how you came to this place that we call home. And around the kitchen table, let's start with Mr. Copperroot, Leaf Copperroot. How did you come to call Palmer home? You were born here, right?
I was born in Anchorage in 1942, and we moved to the Valley in the fall of 1945 after the war ended.
Any
Moved to
brothers
Palmer.
and sisters? Don't you have kind of a large family?
At that point, I had one brother. My brother Noel.
And Carol and Lila, how about you? What's the story of your family coming here? You were obviously born here.
Well, my dad came here. He was in the military. He re-signed up, and he had the opportunity to choose where he would be stationed, and he chose Alaska, and he got stationed on Shimya, which he didn't think was fair. And then but he had an opportunity to come into Anchorage because a plane needed repaired that he was a flight engineer on. And he took a tour bus, of all things, a little tour bus in 1947 to the Matanuska Valley, went up Hatcher Pass, decided that this was going to be his forever home, got out of the military, came back here and married my mom. And I was born in the basement of their home at mile 3 Fishhook Road. And I live at like mile 3.1 now. and so she says how they got here, and I was born 5 years after her, same place, and I live just beyond Carol. So.
And does your mom still live on the homestead?
She does.
Now, Mr. Lynn, you were born here, but you were born outside of Palmer. What was it like growing up outside of Palmer well before the colonists arrived?
Well, Palmer didn't exist as a community at that time. This end of the valley, the community was Matanuska. And in fact, we had a property near the experiment station. You know it probably as the breeding farm now. And I delivered milk in Matanuska before the co-op was in business in Palmer by a rowboat. because the Matanuska River in the fall of the year used to come trickling through Matanuska about 18 inches deep, something like that. And one of the people that lived down there, the east end of the community, ran the water tank for the Alaska Railroad. He built a boat and he would row it from his house over to the depot, walk the tracks up to the water tank and do his thing. When I would come down, I would stop at the top of Tex Cobb's Hill and walk down to the depot, borrow his boat, and row through Matanuska, delivering milk to the a dozen or so old timers that lived there. They had a store, they had a hotel, they had a community hall, they had the depot, they had a section house. But as soon as the co-op, the co-op was created after the corporation came into being, then we went to real milk operations. We didn't sell pasteurized milk anymore. It all went through the processing. So I was born in Anchorage, and my dad was working at the experiment station at the time. And my mother, when it was time for me to be born, took a railroad, Matanuska Railroad trolley car to Anchorage. I was born in the old railroad hospital up above, I think it's C or D Street. And by the way, it disappeared in the '64 earthquake. And then she came back to Matanuska on the train. So I'm the one who's been here the longest, for what little value that has. But I've sure seen a lot of change. Like I say, Palmer didn't exist prior to the colony, except for a few homesteaders and the siding that the Independence Mine used to stack their concentrates on before they were picked up by the railroad the next time the train came through and shipped them down to the smelter. I think it was in Tacoma at that time.
So
Anyway,
where was Matanuska? In
where is
relationship.
Matanuska?
Yeah, where was Matanuska?
Well, if you go down the Glen Highway now, you pass Echo Lake and you go by just before you get to the RV place, Fox Run. On the left, there's a little road and it goes down over the hill, and it follows the branch line down to where it joins the main line. And that was a community that was built by the railroad at the time of the railroad getting construction completed to the Matanuska location. However, the railroad did not continue on towards Fairbanks construction-wise at that time, because the Navy was going to fuel the Pacific Naval Fleet with coal from Chickaloon that had been found. And so all construction towards Wasilla stopped and the branch was completed, and that generated the need to have the community of Matanuska. So it was a full community, grocery store, hotel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, when the Navy decided, no, we're not going to use coal, somebody discovered bunker crude. Then they went on, the railroad went on and completed the line to Fairbanks. And Matanuska was in the process of dying from probably about 1918, 1919 maybe. And Leaf has talked previously about some of the houses that were removed from Chickaloon that were brought into Palmer. So I represent the old people.
You were indeed the salt of the earth.
I'm sorry?
You were indeed part of that salt of the earth.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Lynn. Mr. Copperroot, what was it like growing up as a little boy in Palmer that wasn't much of a town? I think you told me once it was like living in a John Wayne movie. What was it like? What'd you guys do?
Well, Palmer probably had between 400 and 700 people in it for most of the time. that I lived there. So I guess my first recollection was a hospital burning. I would have been 3.5 years old, something like that. And I remember my teeth on the windowsill of our house in Palmer looking at the orange glow from the fire. It was traumatic because my mother was a nurse there. But aside from riding out to the valley in the fall of 1945 with Howard Estelle and my dad, that's my first real memory of it. But as time progressed, there I guess I remember them digging the basement for the hotel, and then they didn't finish it, but it had 48. It was supposed to have 48 rooms. It was this great big sign that said "New Hotel, 48 rooms," and it took forever for them to get it built. Old Kozlowski's, which was down below the blinking light from us, was moved and rebuilt at its location now, which is Vagabond Blues. And Palmer didn't have any paved streets, and it didn't have any sidewalks. It had boards, and they would cup in the sunlight, and they'd turn them over. So they'd cup the other way, and they didn't split. And it had a little piece of sidewalk down by the where the CarQuest is now, which you could skid your bike tire on. Great big rocks. When you crossed the tracks, it wasn't much better, but the trading post was kind of the center of Palmer as far as you could buy everything there. It supplied all of the colonists for their needs, and Kozlowski's was kind of on the other side of the tracks and supplied was in competition with them. But
And I guess eventually won out, right? I mean, I know about Kozlowski.
the colony, the experiment with the co-op failed. Socialism just didn't pan out. Yeah, I mean, they tried it.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying that over the years, the co-op tried desperately to save the dairy industry and exchanged one after another of its equities, the Standard Oil Company, the Co-op Garage, the International Harvester Dealership, its trading post, its carpenter shed. They moved the milk into town. They tried everything they could to save dairying, and in the end, it just, the farmers in Washington were dumping more milk than they could produce here, and the jet airplane would just bring it to Anchorage because they were coming up empty most of the time. And
now, do you have a photo of that old Palmer?
I do. We've rehearsed this, but I'm going to try and get this up here about like, is that about right?
Raise it
Raise it?
a little more. That's
Thank
good.
you, Mr. Lynn.
This is taken from the northwest corner of the existing depot today, looking towards Independence Mine. And you can see there's nothing beyond my folks' white house. That house now has a dormer on the other side of it, but the windows remain the same. And there's a garage in the back that was built in '51. This picture was probably taken in 1940.
1947.
47 or 48 by Lloyd Hill, who was a miner at Independence.
Speaking of Independence Mine, thank you, Mr. Copperwood. Speaking of Independence Mine, you guys lived, Carol and Lila, you lived up near Hatcher Pass. So what was it like living near Hatcher Pass? Do you have any stories about that?
Well, my big memory is we called it Hatcher Pass, but it was Independence Mine, used to be a ski resort. And I
How
use
cool
that
is that?
very loosely, the resort part. But when I was growing up, the PTA sponsored a ski bus. And so the ski bus would leave from Palmer. I think it would leave from Palmer at 8 o'clock, and it would get out to our place between 8:15 and 8:30. And if we were out there at the road with our skis, the bus would pick us up. And if the weather was at all possible, meaning if the bus ran, we rode the bus Saturday mornings and went skiing. And it cost 50 cents to ride the bus. And if you rode the bus, it cost 50 cents for your lift ticket. It was just, at first it was just a tow rope, but we had lots of fun skiing. But one story, one year I must have been in 3rd or 4th grade. And I remember Mom and Pop saying, the weather doesn't look good, but we said, well, we'll go out there, and if the bus doesn't come, then, then it's not good skiing. So the bus came, and we headed up the canyon, and it was snowing pretty hard. And by the time we got going up past the Mother Lode, it was only a one-way road. And if you encountered another car, you had to back down. The car going up had to do the backing down. Well, we were going up, and the snow was getting too deep, and our bus driver, Johan Johnson, or Johansson, he had the bigger boys, and I can't remember who all it was. I know one of them was Mike Rieger. They got out with their skis and tramped a path for each tire to make it, because the bus couldn't turn around. There was no way we could turn around. We just had to keep going, and the bus had chained up. And so we, the big boys got to go out, and I remember my brother, they thought they were big, but they weren't big enough, my brother and his buddies. And at some places, we all had to get out of the bus so that the bus could make it up. And when we got there, of course, it was too snowy, the lift didn't run, and so we just sat and played games in the lodge. And then they didn't think they could get a snowplow so that we could get back down, and we're listening to the radio. And we were on the radio. There were these children stranded up at Independence Mine, and we were just like, so important. And so they were preparing, the Moors ran the lodge then, and they were preparing to let us all sleep. We were so excited because we were going to get to eat their food. And then the plow came through and ruined our plan.
Ruined everything.
And we had to go home, and we didn't even get to ski. But it was a great adventure. We talked for years about being stranded at Independence Mine.
Yeah, that'd be a good one. So was this a May snowstorm, or was this a March snowstorm?
This was probably a March. Probably a March snowstorm.
Yeah, you never know. You just never know. So with talking about that, Leaf, you have a car. You have a story about a car, don't you?
Yeah, when we were kids, my kid brother Noel liked to do it, but we'd go out and we'd buy an old car from a farmer, one that they'd put in the backyard that didn't run, and this place was pretty isolated until after the Alcan opened up, and so these cars would just, they kept running as long as they could. But we bought this one old Hudson Terraplane, and I think it come from a Scheibel place, but I'm not sure, which is about where Seneca is now on the Glen Highway, crossing the second Sprinter system. We got it back to Palmer, to where we lived, and took the fenders off it, and we couldn't get it to hold water because somebody filled it with water and had ruptured the water manifold on one side of it. So we asked everybody who was a mechanic how to stop a water leak, and we got all kinds of advice. Water glass and raw eggs and pepper and chewing tobacco. And so one at a time, we tried all these remedies and nothing worked. And finally, this guy said, well, have you tried oatmeal? And so very patiently, I spooned an entire container of oatmeal into this old Hudson and washed it in there with a garden hose.
And how old are you at this point?
I'm betting I'll be about 10 years old.
About
right?
10 years old.
I got a brother 8 and one 6.
And did you ask your mom for the oatmeal? Did you ask your
No,
mom?
we just
You just
did
stole it.
things.
You just
We
stole it.
just
This
did
is
things.
stolen. This is stolen oatmeal.
Very
Okay.
well, stolen oatmeal. And we got the radiator cap back on, and my dad and Clyde King were drinking beer and kind of watching us do all of this. They weren't supervising, they were observing. But we got the car started, and we ran it about 20 minutes until it finally, the exhaust manifold turned bright red, and it seized up and quit. At which point it would just fuming, just sitting there vibrating. And we went over to take the radiator cap off, and they said, don't do that. You have to wash, well, cool the radiator down with water, So we took the garden hose, and the water that we got, there was a co-op well in those days, and the water was just ice cold. And we cooled the radiator down, and we finally got the cap off of it. And so we backed away from it. And of course, there was a lot of residual heat in the engine. And now it began to vent. And I don't know how much oatmeal you can make with a whole container, but it was more than the Hudson could hold. So it just started blowing it out the radiator cap, and it would blow it about 20, 30 feet in the air, and it'd kind of shower and come down and burn us with stinging hot oatmeal. So we kept trying to get close to the car to put the cap back on because we wanted to drive it, but every time we get close, it'd spit more oatmeal at us. And that went on for about 3 hours. Eventually, it did work. I mean, it didn't leak water anymore, but it didn't cool very well either. And we wrecked the car down at the airport. One of us would steer the car, one person would run the gas pedal because you're too short-legged to do both, and one would observe, and then we'd pack the whole back of it with neighbor kids, and we just drive around Palmer, down towards the airport, not down Main Street, but I mean, Palmer. The airport was way out of town in those days.
That's living the life, Mr. Copperwood, living the life.
I loved it.
Hey, we have Carolyn Covington. Carolyn, do you want to come on in? She might not be.
I'm feeling a little puny, but I'm happy.
Okay.
No, but I'll answer a question or two. That's fine.
Okay. Do you want to move your camera just a little bit?
I gotta get that here in a minute. I'll do this. How's this?
There you go. Hi, Carolyn. How are you? I hope you're feeling better.
I am feeling
I hope
better.
you're feeling better. We're just talking about some of the old days, and I am fascinated with your story about JFK.
Well, I wasn't here for that. I've only done it through hearsay.
So
yeah, I mean, these people. I'm a youngster, even to these people. Carol and Lyle have been here less time than I have, but they started out here. I didn't come till '68.
That's right. You're an old timer. You were a school teacher.
But anyway, the story, yeah, taught school.
Yeah.
But the story about JFK is that there's a picture that I've seen that shows him at the old fairgrounds when he came up, the only presidential candidate to ever come and campaign in Alaska in 1960. And they got stuck in this big Cadillac. And if Mary Combs were still with us, we'd know who the Cadillac belonged to, but she's not. But anyway, she had a picture that showed John Kennedy helping push that Cadillac out of the mud.
Out of the
That's
Matanuska mud. That is,
story.
that just cracks me up.
Out
But
of the
the,
Matanuska mud.
but the Oberg sisters, you knew JFK was in town before anyone else did. And how did you know that?
Well, I did not know it was JFK, but I happened to be riding the Ferris wheel, and it was our one and only day
Oh,
to
she
go
got
to
stuck
the
on
fair.
there.
And so I had a very tight schedule of the rides that I had to ride. And I was on the Ferris wheel and it stopped at the top. Well, that's usually a real thrill to get to stop at the top of the Ferris wheel. But then it never started, like for a long time. There was a big crowd of people down. I could see a big crowd, and I don't even know if I saw someone speaking, but I guess JFK was speaking there. And it seemed like forever up at the top of the Ferris wheel. And then finally it started going again and the crowd had dissipated. But it really did kind of ruin my, schedule of rides that I was going to ride. And when later as we were going home and I said I got stuck at the Ferris wheel, my dad said, well, that was because John F. Kennedy was here and he's running for president. And I knew that my dad was not going to vote for John F. Kennedy. And that was just one more reason that, now he had ruined my fair and I never liked him after that.
You just can't. You can't. Who could? Who could? Who could? But the funny thing is, Mr. Lynn, how many people actually went to see JFK when he was here?
That's kind of an interesting story. We happened to have had a friend who lived in the experiment station housing over near the Kremlin. And of course,
What's the Kremlin? What's the Kremlin? Did I miss something?
Agricultural Research Service building.
Oh,
building.
okay.
It's over there southeast of the Borough building.
Okay.
That's a kind of a colloquialism, I guess you'd call it. Anyway,
Kremlin, I've never heard it called that.
The airplane landed, Kennedy got out, and he got in his Cadillac, probably a convertible, and away they went towards the fairgrounds. And there was one person that was standing along the roadway, and that was this acquaintance of ours. And he said, I really didn't think Mr. Kennedy was going to become president, at least based on what he was doing in the line of visitors and watching his parade going out to the fair. But he made it. He made it.
He made the fair and the presidency.
Yes. Both.
And the Obergs, you were stuck on the Ferris wheel for a parade of one. Was that when the fairgrounds was where the Pioneer Home is now, or is that when it was at the fairgrounds where it's at now? Because you said
that was my understanding. Yes, it was where the fairgrounds is now.
Is now.
I mean, where the Pioneer Home is now.
No.
Pioneer
Pioneer
Home.
Home. Yes, I remember. I don't know if that's when I got lost at the fair, which was a minuscule size at that time. But I remember staying looking at the horses longer than my mom and everybody else wanted to, and they left me.
And they left you.
They left me.
They left you.
And I was lost. And that is the one and only time I remember how small, because all I could see was bottoms and butts and legs. And I remember some teenage girls being sorry for me because I was crying, and then I quit crying. And yeah, it was an interesting, being lost at this huge fair that was so tiny, actually.
Well, it's too bad. It was later, but it's too bad Leaf couldn't have picked you up in his car.
I want to add something. That I saw the picture of Pearl Young's four-door Lincoln with John Kennedy in it.
Oh.
Although
So
I
there you
was in
go.
the Navy, and Pearl Young was the person who ran the soda fountain at the Palmer Drug Store, and that was her car, I believe, that Kennedy rode in. The picture
There
I
you go.
saw,
There
in
you
a
go.
robin egg blue four-door Lincoln.
So thanks, guys. I love that JFK story. It just tickles me. But Mr. Copperwood, that reminds me, how'd you get into the Navy? Wasn't there a canoe club?
Yeah, that we had in the territorial days, we had district magistrates, and May Carter was a district magistrate in Wasilla, and Dorothy Saxton was a district magistrate in Palmer. And as you headed towards graduation, they kind of rounded you up, and particularly if you'd been a truant, which I was. And
well, you're driving your car. You got to be.
Well,
who has time to go to school? You're driving your car.
Well, Bernie had my driver's license a good part of the time for acting up, but he just kept it in his shirt pocket. Bernie was the local constable, but at any rate, Dorothy would ask you some questions, and she would say, "Where are you going to go to school?" And no. Do you have a job? No. Are you going to get married? No. Well, then which branch of the service are you going to go in? And if you didn't have an answer for that, she recommended the Navy, almost summarily. And so joining Dorothy's Canoe Club, which was this, and she put a lot of young men in Palmer in the Navy with Chief Dwyer, which is probably, you know, when I look back at growing up in Palmer, the town raised us. You know, my dad held Alan Lynn up as who I should become, a civil engineer. And you know, I think about, you know, we got in a lot of trouble, but they didn't make criminals of us. They just told us we shouldn't do that. And they set a wonderful example for people on what they expected a young man to be. And I think that finishing school for a lot of us was the Navy, because it is where we went to find out that Palmer was a little town in Alaska. And when you got back from, you know, I was in Chicago when Kennedy was elected, and I didn't know he was in Palmer until I saw the picture of John Kennedy's bare head standing in Pearl's old Lincoln. But what a wonderful place to grow up, and what a wonderful group of people. Mr. DiGiulio, who ran the paper, it was also on the school board. I mean, just there was a lot of people around that were wonderful inspirations to young men, and we formed who we were as people based on those examples. Palmer had an awful rough side too. You know, I peddled papers in the bars, and it was a pretty rough little town.
I want to move just a little bit on the inspiration idea, because I don't want people to miss out on this. And Mr. Lynn, you're a great historian. You know the facts really well, but can you? I know you. It wasn't your deal, but can you explain to us pennies for Palmer?
Well, my version of what pennies for Palmer consisted of was the fact that the original hospital burned in 1946. And it was just after I had left. I went out to Dillingham, worked for the Road Commission that summer. And it just so happened that my girlfriend's dad was the, I guess you'd call it the manager of the hospital at that time. And the next hospital was either a residence building that was moved in by Seth Cook to the location where the state office buildings are now, or a Quonset hut. Both of them occurred in sequence, and I can't remember which sequence. And Leif's much more capable of talking about that than I am. And then subsequently, a real hospital was built in that site. And then ultimately, many years later, when I happened to be on the board of the hospital expanded that site. And then it has ultimately gone out to the private enterprise, Matsu Regional. Well, the Pennies for Palmer was if you will call it, a nationwide financial support program sponsored by the Presbyterian Church in the form of contributing pennies that ultimately represented, as I recall, somewhere in the vicinity of putting $500,000. That was a fund.
That's a lot of pennies.
That's a lot of pennies. That was a fund that was created for the purpose of supporting some of the financial needs of the hospital. Again, Leif knows more about the details of that than I would ever hope to. But it is interesting. If you think about Palmer not being in existence until the colonists arrived effectively in 1935 into a mud bath, and the tents were set up, let's say where Kozlowski's building is now, in that general area. And then subsequently, as construction on the parcels, the 40-acre parcels occurred, then people started moving out into various tent camps that meant that the commuting was a little bit less while they worked on their places. But Pennies for Palmer was a nationwide support group that probably never was very well understood, except for those people who threw the pennies in. But it was a godsend to this community.
Yes, it was. Now, Mr. Copperwood, your mom worked there, didn't she?
My mother came originally in 37. She was 23 years old, and she came from New York to work in the original colony hospital. And she met my dad in I think 1940, and they married, and continued her nursing career, and ended up back in Palmer after the war. And Palmer fell on hard times, as Alan alluded to, and I mean, everybody was in it together. I mean, as I told you, there was no safety net. We were just here, and it was cold, and here you are, eat potatoes and moose meat and carry on. And my mother and Jessie DeVries both volunteered at that old hospital for a couple of years to keep it going, just to have basic health care. And I'm sure that the doctors and the rest of the people, those are the two I remember. I'm sure there were other nurses here. Both the Sherrods, both Max and Dorothy Sherrod were nurses. Vera Tyler, I can think of a lot of people. Mrs. Long, I believe.
You have a picture of your mom, don't you?
I have local friends that we still meet together. We call this picture our moms. And you have in front of you Claire Copperwood and Pat Lawton and Ruth Estelle and Alice Snodgrass. And
so I'm going to say those names again for our listeners. That's Claire Copperwood, Estelle. Say the names again.
Ruth Estelle, who's Bob and Dick and Bill Estelle, and there's Jim who's gone, and Don Estelle and Beth, and I mean we knew all those families, and the Lawtons and Jack Snodgrass, and we were just a gaggle of boys growing up, but our moms all grew into the late age together, and we're still friends after 75 years. I've had the same friends. Joe Lawton and I walked up the railroad tracks together to go to that UP church where the Pennies from Palmer came from when we were 5 years old, which would be or right in there somewhere, maybe 7, but it was before 1950. And we were in the Navy together. We went to AMU together, and we're still friends and play cards today.
That's really sweet.
That's that's what Palmer's all about. That's like Alan Lynn. I've known him my whole life.
I would agree. But some things have changed. But the Oberg sisters, what did you do for fun besides getting stuck on the snow?
Well, I find this kind of interesting looking back, but Palmer was had a lot in the 60s and till about the mid 70s, was really had a lot of entertainment. We had a roller skating rink, and we had a bowling alley. We had a theater. So
I didn't know any of that.
Yeah, we had the Center Theater, which is where is it still Eagle Hotel? I don't know what it is. Golden Eagle Hotel is now. I don't know. It's been several things. So
yeah.
But going to the movies, going to the cinema was like a big deal. I mean, it wasn't a big deal in that we rarely went. We went a lot to the movies. And it was quite often a double feature. In fact, almost always was a double feature, which amazes me. And the theater was really cool because it had a stage in front of the screen. So there was this little stage, and I always thought it would be so fun to go on that stage, but you couldn't go on the stage.
No, because they're watching a movie.
And yeah, and what was really cool too is it had curtains that would come in front of the stage, and then when the movie would start, those curtains, it was like, you know, grand, and the curtains would part, and then one day it was Halloween, and if you came in your costume, I don't know, it was cheaper, and my parents let us go on Halloween, and then there was a big parade of all the costumes, and I got to go on the stage. So that was a really cool thing. And then Carol remembers the bathrooms were in the basement, and it was kind of creepy, but Carol kind of remembers.
Yeah, the basement was kind of like a dungeon almost, and there were restrooms there, but you tried not to have to use the restrooms, or we did as little kids, because there were dirty pictures carved into the paint on the stalls, yes, and dirty words too. And so that was kind of, you know, creepy. But usually, because it was a double feature, you usually did have to use the restroom, but you always made sure your sister or somebody was with you.
Oh, yeah.
There's creepy things down there.
And also the teenagers would go down there to smoke. I remember that. That was like the smoking place was down there. But it was great because my parents they'd always give us enough money to go to the movie and buy a treat, you know, in the concessions, and they had just about everything there. And sometimes we'd be naughty because it was just a little cheaper across at the drugstore, and we would get a treat there and take it in, even though we weren't supposed to.
Oh, sneaky.
Yeah, I know.
Well, Lila, I am really glad you got to go on that stage. It kind of makes up for being lost at the fair and being left. I'm really glad you got the stage idea. We're running out of time, and
there is one thing that's important that should be said.
Yes.
Nobody had anything when the colony started. Nobody had anything. They came from states that had a climate at least as bad as ours, and they were up here for survival. And the people that were here with the colony, the people who came in, like Leif's family, Carol and Lila's family, and so on, those people all stepped in at different stages of the evolution. But I'm telling you, when you went from absolutely nothing, and the kids didn't have any problems in those days because they had chores to do. And if they weren't doing chores, they went out hunting rabbits and so on. So this is an evolving thing. What we have here today is so many light years of what we had ahead of when I was a kid. It is hard to believe. I'm sorry for taking up that time.
Oh, no.
I think it was important to say that.
It is, because it is light years away from where, you know, when you think of the valley being far less than 10,000 people total, you know, just a generation ago, and we're over 100,000 now. Yep. That's a lot of change. It's a lot of change, and I don't want to run out of time. I'm missing all the community service that Carolyn has done, especially with the Women's Resource Center. Carolyn, could you share with us just that short story, how you helped women with the oil boom, but I want to leave time for wind too, a story about wind. So just real short about your Women's Resource Center.
I'll try to be as brief as possible. It's certainly not just me. It was just like Leaf was saying, it was a community thing. The pipeline had been built there, or maybe before the pipeline too. Women were being brought here when the oil lease sale happened in '69, and they opened up the slope, and all at once, all of these people, families from Louisiana and Texas and places not acquainted with the kind of weather that we had. And at that time, my memory is that when the assignments for the men in the slope was 6 weeks, and those women would be here with their families alone. And so what we did, among other things, before the Women's Resource Center, is that we, and Bernice Lynn, Alan's wife, was basically the leader in doing that. And she really did write the book. That there was a little pamphlet book that we built about, okay, so your car's broke down, you can't get it to start, you call Leaf. If you've got a neighbor, rely on your neighbor. Don't hesitate, because these people didn't know anybody. And so we taught them how to just call your neighbor. And then we also had lists of, this is where you can get a plumber, this is where you can get water, this is blah, blah, blah. And from that, as we grew, we began to see the amount of spousal abuse and sexual assault. So we had a really good friend in Jelmer Kurtula. We began to organize, and we worked with the Commission on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, and we organized. And from that began the the Valley Women's Resource Center, which is now Alaska Family Services. So it's another thing, like Alan was talking about, it's an evolution from the kinds of services that we could provide in a minimal way to the vast amount of services that are now available through Alaska Family Services.
Seeing a need and filling that need. I think we have time. Real quick, tell me about the windstorm of '78. Just like blow it by.
I was moved out of Palmer that fall because we were tired of getting the Matanuska wind. We were in a corner of Gulkana and up there in the northeast corner of Palmer anyway. And so we moved out to the southeast corner of Springer Loop. And the next thing you know, the wind came up, and I borrowed a tractor from Lee Hartley, plowed our driveway once so we could come downtown to get some groceries. Some friends of ours that couldn't get home out on off of Bogard said, "Oh, gee, I'm thankful we'll come out with you." And we were locked in effectively for 8 days. The state National Guard was out, Road Commission was out, and still the roads were plugged all the time. It was a nasty wind.
Yeah, I would say that's a
Talk
nasty
about
wind.
it in town.
That would be a nasty wind. Yeah, they closed school, didn't they? That in '78.
Oh, yeah, the schools were closed. Everything was closed. My wife was very upset because we had moved out of town to get out of the Matanuska wind, and for the first time, we were trapped in the wind out there in that new location. Now that happens to have been the last time that we had more than 8 hours of wind in that area. So she succeeded, but not without a painful lesson of what could have happened.
Initiation.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But that was a glorious win. Leaf, talk a little bit about what went on in town during that wind.
Well, Laura France was working over in the tall building when the troopers were over there. I went over to get a permit to move some dozers and for the wind effort. And this lady called up from over there behind along the lake. it was a lake, and she said, somebody in a tank is running around back here behind my house, and they've just ran through our greenhouse and tore our power line down. And it was a National Guard with their little machine, their little zoomy things they got. One of those was, they found it on top of a snowdrift stuck up on the Clark Wolverine Road, and I think that drift was 18 feet high.
Yeah.
But
Whoa.
and they had to dig it out of there and let it down to the road. But it overwhelmed everything. And you know what? Just as a matter of fact, to tell you something, if the wind's blowing, leave it alone. Don't plow it, because the wind will blow it all away. But as soon as you move it, then it starts drifting. And I mean, it raised havoc around here. And when you flew over it after the storm was over, there was no snow anywhere except on the roads where they tried to plow. And it all accumulated on every road. But the fields were bare. There was no anything anywhere. And the funniest story I remember was a guy on the telephone talking with Vic Lawyer, and we were in the hotel bar, and he said, "Oh my God, there's chickens going by. They're backwards, they're forwards, they're this way, they're that way." And the wind had blown the hen house out on Fairview Loop apart and blew all the chickens out of it.
Kind of
And
like the Wizard of Oz right there.
blew them down. Yes, it was.
Yeah, the Wizard of Oz.
And you know, there was about 2 million foxes out there for a month afterwards.
Sure,
All
sure,
eating chicken dinner.
sure. All right. Well, it is time. This hour went very quickly for me. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And the Zoomers out there, we're going to end with kind of a short statement of what we love best about this wonderful place we call home. So in the chat, if you want to leave just a few words of what you love best about this last frontier, that is, as Mr. Copperroot told me, it's like living in a postcard. It's like I was riding my bike into town, and I thought, you know, this is like a National Geographic centerfold, kind of in reminiscence of that, you know, that risque bathroom. The National Geographic centerfold. Maya Angelou has a quote, and it's often quoted, and it's it is agony for a story untold. It's pretty close to that. And I always thought that meant it was an agony not to tell your story. But after listening to you guys tonight, I realized that the quote is an agony not to be able to hear your stories. Mr. Copperroot also told me that history is made through small moments. Maybe you remember telling me this, Mr. Copperroot. Small moments of perspective, whether it's 1920 or 2020. Our perspectives are what makes our stories and our history. And this time, as Mr. Lynn said, it's just outrageously different than what it was. This time is our history, and people will want to hear our stories. So thank you very much for coming and sharing stories about Palmer through the years, the pluck that it took for pennies for Palmer and to take care of things, and the simple fun of being stuck on Hatcher Pass and how wonderful that is, and 50-cent movies, and working together. And well, oatmeal and radiators, who can forget that one? I'm never going to eat oatmeal again like that. But how we help people. That's Palmer through the years. And so thank you for coming. What is in one short statement, what is your favorite thing about Palmer? Let's start with the youngest, Carol and Lila.
I guess that's me. Gosh, being known. I couldn't get away with anything if I'd wanted to. And I liked it until I skipped school one time and got caught. That really bugged me. But other than that, it was great.
I think what I love about living in Palmer is the people. This is a generous community. I am, whenever I'm involved in any service projects and I need people, now that we have this social media thing, I can just post like I did the other night, and I had 20 people show up to help clean a yard that needed cleaned at the Family Promise Center. And that's just because we have great people with great hearts that serve.
Mr. Copperroot.
Oh, I love the place. Knowing so many people, Palmer does not change. The mountains are here. I mean, faces change. A lot of people go away, but it's the same place. And it has a lot of greatness in it, whether it's the cheerleaders that won first place or the baseball team that won first place, or the head of Alaska Airlines who graduated from Palmer High School in 1956, or the Nobel Prize winner that graduated in 1960 something. I mean, Palmer's full of excellence on a world scale. I don't know. I'm pretty sure Eleanor Roosevelt was here, but the quote was, "A nice day in Palmer is as nice as anywhere on earth."
I would
believe
agree.
that.
I would agree. A nice day in Palmer is the greatest thing on earth. So close to that. Miss Cummington, Carolyn, what about you? We're going to come to you, Mr. Lynn, last because you're oldest.
But
Carolyn, there you go.
or did I get unmuted? Okay. It's the people, but also for me, it joins I grew up in Missouri on the prairie, went to college and met my husband in Colorado with the mountains, and it's a protective thing. There's just something about the way that it's laid out, the flat of the farmland, and now the people that live here, and the mountains protecting us. It's just home.
It's just home. Mr. Lynn, what's your favorite thing?
I was very lucky. My wife and I were retired for a number of years. We did a little traveling, and it was wonderful to visit family. It was wonderful to visit friends, but it was even more wonderful after about 30 days to look forward to coming home, where we were very comfortable. And it took my wife about 35 years before she finally acknowledged that she had become a sourdough.
Yeah, I can feel that. Well, thank you all for coming. Take care. Take care of your stories. Take care of each other. Thank you for making Palmer what it is.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yeah, night.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.
I am turning off the recording.